Once again, thank you for joining us for our webinar on education data and student privacy. This webinar is part of National PTA's campaign focused on the value of data from report to results. Before we dive into the presentation, I'd like to give you some background on this campaign as well as updates on our most recent activities. From Report to Results is a 2-year grant-funded program that launched in March 2019. The goal of the program is to help parents read, interpret, and take action on the information contained in state report cards. These report cards are mandated under the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, the 2015 law covering all aspects of K-12 education. National PTA was very involved in advocating for key ESSA provisions, including provisions addressing engagement by parents, teachers, and other stakeholders. ESSA requires every state and local education agency to issue report cards containing data on student achievement, how achievement levels compare against subgroups, high school graduation rates, teacher qualifications, and more. They must be publicly available and written in a way that is uniform and easy to understand. States were also required to develop their report cards in consultation with parents. These report cards are an essential part of effective family and stakeholder engagement. National PTA developed our From Report to Results campaign to raise families' awareness of state report cards and help them understand what they mean. But first, let's take a step back and discuss why it's important for parents and families to become informed and engaged on the topic of education data. Why is National PTA engaged in this campaign? It's because we know that education data is crucial to knowing how schools are serving students and where there is room for improvement. The data in state report cards can tell us whether schools are equitably serving all students in their communities. It can provide a window on which curricula and teaching methods lead to optimal outcomes. Knowing how to find, understand, and interpret education data allows us as PTA members to see what is working in schools, what isn't, and where we should advocate for change. From Report to Results has 3 goals: to educate parents and families on the value of data, give parents and families tools and knowledge to understand and interpret education data, and help parents advocate for and with meaningful education data. To achieve these goals, National PTA has been working on 2 parallel tracks. One important element of the campaign is our collaboration with state grantees. National PTA is working with 5 state PTAs to deeply engage parents and families on the importance of education data and how they can advocate for good data and with good data. The resources and trainings provided are designed to help parents understand the value of data, develop key advocacy skills and tactics. The goals are to ensure parents know about the state report cards, how to access them, and lastly, how to use them to advocate for change. If you are located in one of these 5 states, please check out the state PTA's webpage to learn how you can get more involved in this effort. Just as important as our state collaboration is our national outreach. National PTA believes it's important for parents across the country to understand the value of student data and have the tools to interpret it. We've developed a series of resources for parents, such as one-pagers, which are all available on our website, pta.org. We've also collaborated with organizations such as the Data Quality Campaign and Future of Privacy Forum on webinars, like this one. We're especially excited about our 2 newest resources. We know one hurdle for parents can be navigating cumbersome websites to find their state report card. Our new interactive map links parents directly to their state's ESSA report card, eliminating that obstacle. We've also just released a brand new one-pager on disaggregated data to help parents understand how to interpret data about student performance broken down by different student groups. To learn more about education data and access these and other resources, check out www.pta.org/ESSA. If you have questions about From Report to Results, feel free to reach out to the Government Affairs team at National PTA. Now, let's get started with our presentation. So let's get started. Once again, my name's Eileen Huck with National PTA, and I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm so pleased to welcome you to this webinar co-hosted by National PTA, the Data Quality Campaign, and the Future of Privacy Forum. The topic of education data and student privacy is so important, and I know our two presenters have some valuable information to share with us. Moving on to the agenda for the evening, we will hear first from Brennan McMahon-Parton of the Data Quality Campaign with an explanation of different kinds of student data, how data is used by educators, and why it's important. She will be followed by Amelia Vance, Director of Education Privacy at the Future of Privacy Forum. Amelia will discuss state and federal laws addressing data privacy and what parents should be aware of when it comes to student data. After the presentations, we will have time for questions. Please submit your questions through the webinar and I will read them to the panelists. We will respond via email tomorrow to any question we're not able to get to tonight. In addition, this webinar is being recorded and will be sent to all webinar attendees tomorrow. Now let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Brennan McMahon-Parton of the Data Quality Campaign.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Eileen. Always happy to join the PTA. I have to kick off by saying I am doing this webinar from my home this evening. So if you hear any yelling in the background, do not fret. This is just my husband watching the opening game of the World Series. I'm expecting it to get loud in here, but hopefully all the fun stuff will happen a little later on. Anyway, my name is Brenda McMahon-Parton. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director at the Data Quality Campaign. If you are not familiar with us, DQC is a national advocacy organization focused on the effective use of data in education. We have just one line in the sand, and that's that data should work for students. So we advocate for policies and practices that make that happen. On the next slide, you will see what we call the big idea. The big idea is that when students, when parents, when educators, when partners have the right information to make decisions, students excel, This is what we believe in. But I will say, this vision is not that useful if only DQC believes in it. We really want this to be something that you all as leaders within the PTA can pick up and carry, that we hope policymakers nationwide to pick up and carry, and we really intentionally put students at the center. This is not about systems, this is not about accountability, this is about information that meets people's needs and that helps people answer questions and take action. So on the next slide, so I've already said data probably 6 or 7 times just in my opening. It's hard not to, it's in the name of our organization. But what do we mean when we say data? What is student data? It's a lot of things. And I bet when I say that word, you all have your own take on what you think that word means. Often, the most common thing that comes to people's mind is assessments. Often that can be the 4-letter word, the end of the year test. But it's bigger than that. It's, of course, tests, summative, formative, mid-year, teacher-made, standardized, all those varieties, anything that we use to diagnose where students are. And that's definitely part of it, but it's also more than test scores. And so this infographic is just to help us demonstrate the breadth. And I think, we made this 4 or 5 years ago, and data is constantly evolving. It's probably not even capturing the full breadth anymore. But if you think about things like observations, student attendance, their projects, their portfolios, student growth information, and more, all help round out the picture of student learning. And I shall say, we believe deeply at DQC, no one data point is enough. It's not a silver bullet. How we use data must help us round out the picture of students' learning, not define it alone. But we do think in the hands of students, of teachers, of parents, that it's essential to improving students' education. So on the next slide, I've mentioned a few stakeholders already. Who uses student data? Who are we really talking about? Most data, you'll see on the next slide, stays local. It stays in classrooms with teachers, it stays in schools with teams of educators, and it stays at the district level. Districts are probably the primary collectors of information. And there's also a larger data ecosystem that informs decisions at every level. I'll pause just 1 second so we can get this picture up on the screen. There we go. So like I said, most of it stays local. You can see a lot of those things I mentioned from the previous slide around interventions and grades and observations, and that stays between the teacher and student or between the principal, teacher, and student. But there are many leaders who have a role to play, including the district, state departments of education, and finally the United States Department of Education gets a limited and aggregate number of information. we really believe, and I would, empower everyone to advocate that data should only be collected if it has a purpose, if it has a value, if it's informing conversations about students, whether that be at the aggregate level at the state or the individual level in the classroom. It should all be about helping students. And I know Amelia will talk about some of these. You can see our red and white flags between each of these. She'll hit on these privacy protections, these gateways between data systems. And I should say also that states have information in a lot of places. There's K-12, that's mostly what I'm talking about right now when I talk about classrooms, but they also have higher ed, or you may have heard of a P20W, or a statewide longitudinal data system. There's different places that are collecting and managing data, and like I said, that should always be about helping individuals. On the next slide, it can be hard to imagine a picture of what that looks like why have all these big interconnected systems at the state level? That sounds far off. It doesn't sound like it helps me as an individual, but it can, and most importantly, it should. The value of having data across systems and sectors, so like I said, P20W, and I'll just define that to say early childhood, just the P, pre-K, K-12, post-secondary, and the workforce, is to inform students and their families at every point in their journey and to help them make decisions about education, college, careers, and everything in between. Right now, many states do have aggregate information about these student pathways. And in some states, we can even figure out what works. So do we know what correlates to college admissions and persistence, things like that. But that information is really hard to get. It's not always publicly available. Even researchers who go through these extensive IRB processes may have challenges in getting to that information. And that's why voices like yours as parent leaders is so important. This is not their data, it's our data, it's your data. And when we have these stories, when we have these connected systems that can help us understand Grace's path to success, like you see in this picture, or any child's path to success, you should have access to that. So I'll just give one example. Is post-secondary enrollment tied back to high school? Most states are able to understand where kids from any given high school go on to at least post-secondary institutions in their state. So maybe a community college, a four-year college, whatever. Over 40 states have at some point published that data. But last year on report cards, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about, and which are states' most publicly facing resource, barely half of them had included that on the report card side by side with other information you may be familiar with, like high school graduation rate or assessment performance, things like that. So states are capable of this and they need to be putting it out. This is my big message for this. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about parents, about folks like you. Every year, DQC conducts a national representative poll of parents and teachers, just to take the pulse. We want to understand, data is a wonky topic. It's a big topic. We want to know, how are people feeling about data? How are they feeling about this in their students' lives? And this year we had some really interesting findings. This was the big thing that emerged for us. You can see here, we found that parents are ready for the next generation of data use. They're asking for that whole picture of student learning inside and outside of the classroom, but teachers are still just getting by and largely alone in their classrooms. So you can see, big top line message, parent demand for data no longer in question. Vast majority say that they need data to understand their child's progress. They support teachers using data, and they report that they would use information to learn more about the performance of their school. So not just their kid, but the school that they're in. On the next slide, parents are interested in having access to information about how their child's school educates kids like theirs. So there's been you may have heard, there's been some conversation going on since the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and with states revamping their report cards about whether information that's broken down by different groups of students is important. Well, we found that parents think it is. 81% of parents overall want to know, what are kids like? How are kids like mine doing in the school? 92% of Black parents and 78% of Hispanic parents. So getting that breakdown of how is the school serving kids, how are they performing in the school, is important. So on the next slide, this is where we're starting to see this next generation of data use. And so we have 71% of parents agree that different public agencies should securely share, that's a lot of in a row, information with about the children and families to improve their services. So going back to that picture of Grace traveling through her journey from education to college and career, we're seeing a lot of parents saying they want to have that picture in data. They want state agencies to share it so they can make informed decisions about pathways. And 69% of parents agree that schools should be able to securely share information about a child's performance in school with organizations outside of school. So if you've got your kid in an after school program that's maybe a specialized thing that's giving them advanced work, or if it's a tutoring thing to help them catch up, why shouldn't the information about how they're doing in the classroom and how they're doing in that program go back and forth to give you the most well-rounded picture of that student's learning? And I should say, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about next generation, is really just being okay with something that we believe states should be doing, which is helping us understand what works for kids, what are the pivotal points along their pathway. And I don't have the data in here about teachers, but what we found teachers is that they're getting by in their classrooms. They're taking time out of their own day to look at data. They're teaching themselves on the job, and that they value it. So they're saying it's important, but they're really having to do the hard work on their own to get that done. Meanwhile, parents are saying, like, yeah, let's share. Yes, I want to understand. Yes, I want to know how kids like mine are doing. Yes, I want to be able to see data points along with what I know in my community about how the school is doing. So it's really an evolving landscape, but we have seen increased support for the use of data by both parents and teachers. So going on to the next slide, I've said this a few times, but states have this data. They have the ability to collect this data, but it isn't their data. It's our data. As families, as members of the community, as students, you deserve to have access to this information, of course, while protecting students' privacy, security, and confidentiality. And one really important way for you to engage with the data that your state has and should be making available is through an online report card about the schools in your community. And I know as members of the PTA and leaders in your state, you may have had a hand in helping your state leaders think through what these report cards should look like in the past few years. And I think you're also a really important voice to continue to put what we talk about as the light and the heat on states. The light, celebrate good practice, applaud them where they've done something good, and the heat, push them where things should be better. States are going to need continued support and pressure to make report cards better, but to make this the most public source of data better and better every year. So going on to the next slide. So it says what's new this year. In reality, report cards that were revamped report cards, I should say, that were prompted by the Every Student Succeeds Act are going into, depending on your state, your second or third year, but new things are happening every year. So some things to really be looking for this year. A lot of states are already starting to put out in the past month or so, and will through the end of the year, their let's see if I can get this right, 2017, 18, I guess, report cards. There's still new information coming out. So you should look for additional information about the performance of certain groups of students. Foster care, homeless, military connected, that's on top of the groups of students that states will already, or should already be breaking down by race, ethnicity, special education, English language learner. I know it's a lot, all critically important. Other things we really want people to watch for. So in addition to, the chronic absence and student performance and graduation rate data, that's very likely part of your accountability system and therefore absolutely should be available on your report card. New information should be coming out this year, including discipline data. How often are we suspending kids in this school? Teacher data. How experienced are the teachers in this school? Do the students who are perhaps the poorest in this school or district have access to the most experienced teachers? And finally, financial data. You may also hear this talked about as per pupil expenditure data. Really an effort in report cards now to not just do average, so taking the full district sum and dividing by the number of schools, but drilling in and saying how much money does this individual school actually have, including the salaries of those teachers in that school, which is a huge part of any school or district's budget. It's a huge part of the money that they're spending on students, are those educators to teach those students. And I want to put a little bit of a plug in on right here as I'm talking about report cards. Data Quality Campaign with the PTA recently put out a resource about student growth data. Almost every state included student growth data in their accountability systems. That should absolutely be on your report cards. But what it means and what it tells you about student learning is different in every state. So if you haven't checked out that resource, you can ping Eileen or you can ping me, and happy to send that along. So DQC over the past couple of years, we've been spending a lot of our time finding state report cards, and it ain't easy. If you don't know exactly where to go, it is not an easy task, but also thinking about beyond this breadth of data that they should be including, what makes them good? What makes someone want to plug in and read and dig into this information that maybe they don't spend all day thinking about? And so we've got this is even a short version of our checklist, but A1A, the first thing, is it easy to understand? Like once you actually find the thing, can you understand it? Are there explanations that make sense in language that it doesn't take a doctorate in education to understand? I also think it's critically important. Every single state in this country has a population that speaks something other than English as their first language, and every single one of those people deserves to be able to find information about the schools in their community in the way it makes most sense to them. So it should be translated. It should be organized in an easy way. You should be able to navigate through it and know what you learned at the end. If there's deeper dives on the data or download files or I don't know, just wonkier stuff, it should be pretty clear how to get there. Maybe you're someone who wants the 30-second version, and maybe you're someone who wants the 30-minute version. That shouldn't be hard. It should be easy for you to follow that path. And finally, complete data about student performance. I talked a couple of times now about student data broken down by different groups of students. Too many states are burying that. They're making it hard to find and understand. That should be right up front. It's not only the law, but people deserve to understand how schools are serving groups of students. Going on to the next slide, state leaders are responsible for this. They're responsible for creating a clear picture of how schools are performing. Of course, districts have a hand in this too, but we really want to hold states accountable. Like I said, they have all this information that can tell us so much about student performance and school quality, and they should do it. And they should do it in a way that you and I and anyone can understand. And you as parent leaders have such a strong role in making that happen. And like I said, keeping the light and the heat on states. So just my final soapbox here is in your communities, and I would love to hear back from people about what works best for you and what are good conversations that you've had in your state and communities. But these are good questions to ask of yourself and ask of your neighbors and peers. If an average time constraint parent, or I should just say like any human being who wants to know this, having kids running around makes that time constraint even tighter. Could you easily find it? Can you understand the information that's being shared? Does it answer the basic questions that you have about your school? And does it help you understand how that you can use this data to take action? They shouldn't leave you hanging. So with those questions in mind, with that sort of data 101, I will stop and turn it back to Eileen.
Brendan, thank you very much for that very informative presentation. And now I'd like to turn to Amelia Vance, who is Director of Education Privacy with the Future of Privacy Forum, for an analysis of state and federal laws addressing data privacy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eileen. I am thrilled to be speaking. Like Brennan, I'm going to give the caveat that I'm at home and cell phone service is mostly good. So if I cut out at any point, let me know. But really excited to talk to you all. So as Eileen mentioned, I'm mostly going to focus at a very high level on sort of federal and state laws. So Eileen, if you'd like to move to the next slide, there is a guide that National PTA and my organization, the Future of Privacy Forum, put out back in 2015 with Connect Safely, which is sort of a broad parent's guide to student privacy. The link is on there, and I'm sure it can be sent out in the materials afterwards. If you want to dig in a little more, you can check out this guide. So in order to use data in the valuable ways that Brennan outlined, it is vital that each of you be able to trust that data is used appropriately and that your child's privacy is protected. So just as all of us have moved to the digital world through smartphones and laptops, social media, voice-activated speakers, all the other things. Schools have moved to the digital world as well. Everything from digitizing student files that used to be in a dark file room to providing students with laptops or tablets and using apps that make learning more fun and engaging. It's very important that schools be transparent with all of you about those changes and the implications for how student information is collected, used, and protected. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk at a very high level about Student Privacy 101 and go pretty fast and try and cover the top 9 laws protecting student privacy, some of your rights as parents, and questions that you might want to ask. The next slide, the main law that protects student privacy is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. It was passed back in 1974, interestingly, because people were starting to talk about computers. So if you dive into the legislative history way back in 1974, you had the folks that introduced this law thinking about how when you moved records from that dark file room and put them online, what does that mean? It means that parents will be farther removed, that the information may go to people that they don't know about, and that they may not have easy access to those records. And so FERPA was really built around those two principles. They wanted to make sure that students and parents have access to their own education records or their child's education records, and making sure that the law was preventing unauthorized disclosure of those education records. So really focused around these two principles, especially the access aspect. Back in 1974, you'd had a series of articles where parents were unable to get access to their child's records, unable to get schools to respond to them and change inaccurate information. In some cases, even unable to discover potentially harmful information about students' futures, racist comments, other things in those records. And so FERPA was really focused in on making sure that that access was allowed and making sure that privacy was protected. However, it's not privacy against everyone because schools need to function. Schools need to be able to share information. You don't get to go to school anonymously. The teacher will call your name and they will hang student artwork, and there are all sorts of ways that your privacy is not really violated because we're all sort of used to it, but where your privacy is a little less because you're interacting with the world. So diving in deeper to what specifically FERPA allows, going to the next slide there, you have certain rights under FERPA as a parent, or once a student turns 18 is usually the rule of thumb, they have the rights that before then are given to their parents. So that right includes an annual notification of the school's FERPA policy, a right of access to your child's education records, and the right to seek amendment or correction of your child's education records. On the next slide, the other two rights that you have are a right to confidentiality of the personally identifiable information in a student's education records. So basically that means the information that is provided to the school that is about your child has to be kept confidential. And then finally, and very important, you have a right to file a complaint with the Department of Education for any alleged violations of FERPA. So those are the main rights. Let's dig into, I said FERPA was all about access and privacy. Let's look at the access provisions on the next slide. So again, right to inspect and review their own education records. The school has to respond to requests for inspection within a reasonable time, but no later than 45 days. As we're going to talk about in a minute, several states have shortened this timeline. The school cannot delete or destroy any records well a request from the student or parent is pending. And they can't charge an unreasonable amount. And this has been interpreted pretty broadly. Basically, if the amount of money that the school is charging for you to get access would not allow you to get access to those records, it likely is too much money, and the Department of Education wouldn't allow your school to charge that much money to get access. So let's look at the privacy part. So before information is disclosed to third parties, except in specific exceptions, written consent is required from the parent or, once the student turns 18, from the student. Any third-party recipients have to agree not to redisclose the information. So even if someone gets the information, most of the time, they cannot redisclose that. A school must keep a record of all third-party requests and disclosures with the record. So if you requested your child's record, you could also get information about who it had been disclosed to. And then finally, it does allow for non-consensual disclosure in certain limited circumstances. So let's talk about what those exceptions are. On the next slide, I go through some of the most common exceptions that you'll likely hear about from schools. So first and foremost, I mentioned nobody goes to school anonymously. So there is an exception that was put into place 6 months after FERPA was passed, because all of the schools and everyone else had no idea what to do with this law. All of a sudden, you had this law that said people had a right of access and a right of privacy. Well, does this mean that we can have playbills? Does this mean we can have PTA directories? Does this mean we can have school photographs? And so they wanted to clarify the law. And so they added in the directory exception. The directory information exception says that a certain list of information that the school has to provide to you in their annual notice can be disclosed to other people at any time at the school's option. So they don't have to turn over information, but they can. So this allowed the PTA directory and other things to keep going. However, just by its nature, a directory could be passed around. It could go to multiple people. And so there's a special privacy protection put into this. The directory information exception allows parents to opt out of it. So once a year in your annual FERPA notice, you'll get a question about whether you would like to opt out of sharing directory information. Now, most parents choose not to take advantage of this. As I said, it can get really inconvenient. Your child might not be included in a school yearbook or the directory or a playbill or the list of athletes at an event. But some schools have gotten really nuanced about this and say, okay, you can opt in to information just being used for these school purposes and for no other purposes. So that's the directory information exception. Happy to talk more about it in Q&A if useful. The others I'm going to go through really quickly. The school official exception is basically if a third party is doing something that the school would otherwise do themselves in an ideal circumstance. So your school would probably do whatever they could to make your child's life better. They might create, an app. They might have a personal tutor for each and every child. They might make sure that there is a flurry of nurses for any medical conditions, whatever it is. The school official exception allows schools to share information with third parties that help schools do their jobs. So this is everything from school catering to the bus driver, school nurses, even teachers. Anyone who needs information usually will get it under this exception. They can only use the information for the purposes for which they got it. They can only use it for a legitimate educational purpose. And that is all limited by the school. And once they get information, they're not allowed to redisclose it. It is a fairly strict exception. And under any of these exceptions, except for the one that you can opt out of, the directory information exception, information cannot be redisclosed beyond the first person who has received the information. And there's usually a contract in place to ensure that that's how it's working. The other exception, health and safety exception, if there's an emergency, if there's a hurricane, if there's something violent at school, information can be given in that emergency. So essentially, if you need to know that Sarah is in XYZ classroom because there's a hurricane coming or whatever it is, you can tell someone that Sarah is in XYZ classroom and you need to go get her. That is totally fine. If there is an imminent emergency, information can be disclosed under that exception. You also have exceptions that allow information to be shared to make sure that everything is working in education. And then finally, you have law enforcement access via subpoena or under that emergency exception that may come into play if there's some sort of law enforcement matter, but they have to go through a judge to get a subpoena to get access to information. So moving past federal laws into state laws, this has been a big shift over the past few years, largely driven by parents like you who, as I said, want better information about how student data is being collected, used, and protected. And so we've seen a big land shift in what laws are in place. So before I dive into the laws themselves, I want to talk about the concerns that have driven some of these laws. So on the next slide, there are really two primary concerns that we've seen as we've dug into some of these laws. So number one is commercialism. People want to make sure that their child's not being advertised to, that their child's information isn't being used to market products to them, whether, you know, in a particular app or elsewhere. They want to make sure that schools have relationships with trusted third parties who are going to treat that information in the educational way that it should be in order to help students learn. So that's something we saw quite a bit of. Even though FERPA doesn't allow student information to be sold, to be used to target advertising to students, all of that, as I said, FERPA is a pretty old law and it didn't always state those things clearly. And so one aspect we saw of state laws was digging into commercialism, saying advertising, targeted advertising to kids is not okay. Selling student data is not okay. Making sure that information is only used for educational purposes is really important. So that was really emphasized in many of the laws we saw. Second, there's been a concern about putting students on track. So making sure as we have algorithms and AI and machine learning, all of these sort of mathematical equations and coding and all of that, that's predicting, you know, well, you might learn better this way instead of that way, or any of it, that we make sure that bias that all of us have isn't baked into that we make sure that students have just as much opportunity as they could possibly ever have. And so part of that is making sure that the data that is being used is unbiased, as Brennan was noting, making sure that those students in various categories are being treated equally. And so one of the things we saw in some of the state laws was pushing back on anything that would hinder or limit the opportunities of students. So part of this was done through transparency. Part of this was done by pushing back on the collection of certain data points that legislators thought might be prejudicial. So moving from the concerns into the laws, as I mentioned, there has been a big shift. So this is actually last year's map. We've had now over 130 laws passed in 41 states since 2013, with all 50 states introducing at least one student privacy law since 2013. In addition to the 130 plus laws that are specifically about student privacy, You also have another 60 to 70 that mention student privacy in some way. This is how important this topic has been to legislators across the country, and we have continually seen a focus on keeping students safe and making sure that this area is appropriately legislated. So these laws ended up sort of splitting in two different directions. So on the next slide, you can see that one type of law that we've seen is building on FERPA. It's aimed at state and local education agencies, so your schools, your state departments of education, and saying, as I said, that they have to be transparent, that in some cases, maybe the number of days they have to turn over the student record should be less than that required by FERPA, making sure that there's someone in charge of privacy, making sure that there is a written data governance policy that you could potentially get access to. All of those things are some of the laws that we saw. The other side of the coin was focused really deeply on the commercialization concern that I mentioned, which is to say they dug into ed tech companies and to other companies in schools. So about 26 states have passed laws that are specifically aimed at companies and put them directly on the hook for any student privacy violations, saying, as required under FERPA, they can't redisclose that data, they can't sell it, they can't target advertising to students, they can only use it for an educational purpose. So we see these themes again and again throughout all of these laws. On the next slide, I include in here just a link to the website that I run, the Student Privacy Resource Center, FERPA Sherpa, where we have a list of all of the state student privacy laws that have passed since 2013, so you can look up what your state has done. However, it's not been an easy journey. So on the next slide, I highlight a couple of the headlines that we saw. It's not enough to make sure that we're protecting the privacy of children. We need to make sure that we're doing it in a smart way that benefits every child. So we saw some states be so strict with their privacy laws that they had the same problems that schools had back in 1974 when FERPA was passed. So Louisiana required that parents opt into all data sharing, and I'm sure all of you know the amount of paperwork that you're already getting from schools and the number of forms you have to sign. So this pretty much more than quadrupled it and had parents signing off on everything from having football player names announced to hanging student artwork in the hallway to doing school pictures. And unfortunately, the year that this law was in place, there were some students who weren't referred to the state scholarship funds because they weren't able to get parental signatures from all parents. The law was amended the following year, but we've seen unintended consequences like this from a couple other laws. So, for example, New Hampshire's legislature passed a law restricting video recordings in classrooms. However, they didn't actually talk to any teachers about this because many teachers are required as part of their certification to record themselves in the classroom. You also have several special education students that need video recordings as part of their IEPs. And so you had some restrictions on video recording for about a year. It had to go through school board and the principal and all parents and all students. And it just made it really hard for schools to function. It made it really hard for students to get the accessibility tools that they needed to learn. Fortunately, that law was mostly fixed the following year. And this is a trend we continue to see where sometimes laws go a little too far in the restrictive direction and then are often brought back by state legislators. But it's important to remember that the students that didn't get their information shared with the state scholarship fund don't get a second chance. And so it's really, really important that as we talk about privacy, we're also making sure that we're smart about it, that we are protecting student privacy and protecting the things that can help children do better, that can help children succeed. And that involves bringing in all of you, teachers and administrators and others, to legislatures whenever laws are passed to make sure that the smartest possible law is passed. Unfortunately, in the past couple years, we've seen something a little bit different. So we've moved away from a lot of the unintended consequences of privacy laws going too far and sort of bounce to the other side. So on this next slide, I provide some examples of this. We've seen states sharing more data for example, trying to prevent school shootings, to prevent abuse of disabled children and others. And these laws may actually be pretty harmful, at least without privacy guardrails to make sure that rights are protected. So the law I just mentioned, there are cameras in any special ed classroom in Texas where one person in the district requests it. Unfortunately, the state did not provide any money to do this, so this costs a whole lot of money. And it's not really clear what the data governance is around that. Who has access to the data? When does it get deleted? How is it being used? How do you make sure that you're not violating the rights of one student in the classroom while you're using the data for something else? Does it make sense to use money to buy video and audio equipment versus perhaps bringing on additional aids? We've seen the same thing in the school safety context, where you had a state require that parents disclose past student mental health referrals. And that's everything from ADHD to depression to other things that parents do not want to disclose, that schools don't need to serve their child. And so it's very important moving forward that all of you are aware how important it is that you're weighing in, that your voice is there, that you make sure that legislators know that privacy guardrails are necessary, and that we want to make sure that student data is always used in a way that brings opportunities to students as opposed to takes them away. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Eileen, and happy to answer any questions.
Wow, Amelia, thank you so much for that really informative presentation. You gave us a lot to think about and chew over, as of course Brennan did as well. So now, for those members of the audience, this is your opportunity to pose questions if you'd like to, and they will. And once again, any questions that we're not able to get to this evening, we will respond to via email tomorrow. So we have one question, and this may be for Amelia, a question about whether the directory exception is also extended to online photos.
That's a great question. So as part of that annual notice that schools are required to give to you as a parent every year, they list all of the data that they define as directory information. And so if they're listing online photos as part of that list, then it would count as directory information. If they're not, then it doesn't. However, you should always feel free to ask your school why something is considered directory information. And as I said, many schools are finding that it's beneficial to have a more nuanced directory information policy, where you can allow parents to opt out of having data shared perhaps online or with non-school parties, but you still want your kid included in the yearbook or other things like that.
Thank you for that really great question. Let's see. There's a question about adding migrant students to the data that covers foster, homeless, and military. Brennan, is that something that you could weigh in on?
Yes, and actually information about the performance of migrant students is already required. So if you're not finding that on your report card right now, it's a good thing to reach out to your state about, I should say. I will say that given some of the current political conversations, we have heard that some districts and states are nervous about reporting that information, but it is required under ESEA.
And thank you for that great question, by the way. And here's another really interesting question. What do we know about the 20 to 30% of parents from Brennan's presentation who don't seem interested in data and who don't seem interested in data and are not interested in having that information publicized?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't know a lot. What I do know is specifically on report cards, we ask if so part of our poll last year also was, have you accessed a report card, which I talked about a little bit in the past year. Fully 60% of parents said yes, 40% said no. Of that 40%, 40% of those parents said they didn't even know it existed, and the other 40% said basically that's just not the resource that they wanted to use. They couldn't find it. It wasn't interesting to them. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag when you get into that smaller set of people. They feel like they either don't have time, don't care, or have other sources of information.
And so here's another question having to do with state report cards. Can you talk a little bit more about reasons why the data is not easily available in some states and districts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Seriously, one I think about every day. So I think there's a few things. So one is, and I'll say this, let me preface by saying, I think this is absolutely hands down, period, a responsibility of states. They've got to be better at getting the information out. This needs to be a continuous pursuit for them. They need to be thinking about how people are going to access this information, where they're going to find it online, like, period. I believe that. And also, I think when ESSA passed, gosh, now four or 5 years ago, right? And said, make a report card that's friendly to parents. That in a lot of ways, that was the first time that states had thought about it. And I always tell people, I think it's kind of a bummer that it took an act of Congress to get states to think about whether the information they were putting out was actually useful to people, but it did take that. So a lot of them are taking on a new task, trying to put themselves in the shoes of someone who's not just the superintendents who call to yell at them or the principals who call and yell to them, and they're having a bumpy road. A lot of them will complain about resources, funds, time, those kinds of things. But the flip side of this is, I think, honestly, for a lot of states and districts too, I've talked mostly about the state, but this is true across the board. It can be scary to ensure that everyone has access to the same information that they have. If you're a leader who's got this treasure trove of data, you want to control the narrative about what that information says, right? If you want to highlight successes or say that your policies are gaining traction and you have the information to back that up, that's what you're going to want to put out. And so truly democratizing and this information and getting the hands of parents and communities and advocates takes some pushing. It can be scary for leaders to do that. So I think there's a few things at play here.
Thank you for that. And we have a question here, I think maybe for Amelia. What should parents know about the new emphasis on threat assessments with respect to data sharing and privacy concerns?
That is a fabulous question. So for those who don't know, there was a process adopted starting in Virginia a few years back that wanted to focus on children holistically when examining whether or not there was a threat. And so what this has become is that many schools have adopted what is called a threat assessment team. And it's usually made up of a school administrator, maybe a teacher, a mental health professional at the school or someone outside of the school, usually a law enforcement representative, whether the school resource officer or someone from the local police department, and a couple others. And when threats come up, their job is to look at that student across the board, not just as a potential threat, not in a light of, oh, we're trying to figure out who should go to prison, they're trying to figure out what are the interventions that this particular child needs in order to make sure that whatever threat, whether to that child or to others, is neutralized, and to make sure that they grow up to be the best person they can be. That's the ideal version, and that's what we sort of seen being implemented across the country. Unfortunately, it's not always implemented well. We've heard about districts that are not disclosing information to parents when their students are going through threat assessments, students who have de facto dropped out, students with disabilities being targeted, and a lot of other stories that say that there needs to be a lot more training and a lot better transparency with parents about these processes. So the number one piece of advice I can give there is utilize your FERPA rights. If your child or others are going through a threat assessment and the school won't tell you why it's happening, won't provide information, and it's just continuing for months and really becoming a nightmare for your family, use your FERPA rights. Ask for that record. You have a right to it under FERPA, and it's very important that these processes be transparent and actually serve all students.
And here's another really good question. We talked about state laws with unintended that have come with some unintended consequences. Are there any state laws that are considered best practices, and which states might those be?
Absolutely. So usually, at least in my opinion, the states that are the best are the ones that have covered all their bases. So, for example, do they have a law that's targeted at edtech companies? Do they have a law that's targeted at districts? Do they have a law that is targeted at states? Basically, is there a governance structure that says what each of those parties have to do to protect privacy, that puts protections and parental and student rights in place? And so, in addition to that, you also obviously want to mitigate unintended consequences. So the states that come closest to meeting my mark there, Utah has a pretty phenomenal bunch of laws, and they've actually been very proactive and made small changes each year in response to district feedback. You have Colorado that has a pretty all-encompassing law. Georgia is particularly renowned for their student privacy law. It's really excellent, and it created a chief privacy officer position. And then, as I mentioned, there are various other states that have sort of one side of the equation, you know, a law dealing with vendors, but not a law dealing with districts, or various things like that. So there are a lot of states that have really good laws on sort of one side of the equation and not others. But because I sort of like to make sure that all of the governance bases are covered, I really like to focus on those three states.
Well, since we are about out of time, this is the end of tonight's webinar. So I would like to give special thanks to our panelists, Brennan McMahon-Parton and Amelia Vance, for their informative and thoughtful presentations. We are so grateful for your time. For all attendees, please know that this webinar has been recorded and a link will be sent tomorrow to everyone who attended. If you submitted a question that we weren't able to answer, we will respond to you tomorrow via email. Thank you to everyone for attending this evening, and have a good night.